Harlem in those days did not announce its suffering with sirens or speeches. It carried it quietly, in the way shopkeepers opened late after a bad night, in the way mothers watched their children cross streets as if asphalt itself had learned cruelty, and in the way men paused before speaking certain names. It was the early hours of a Tuesday when Ruby Williams' name first passed from mouth to mouth. Not shouted, not broadcast, but carried like something fragile that could break, if handled carelessly. She was 18, and in Harlem that meant she was old enough to be noticed by the world, but still young enough to believe it might be kind if she behaved properly. She lived in a narrow apartment where sunlight came in sideways, where her mother pressed dresses with meticulous care, and where every mirror reflected not vanity but preparation, as if the family understood that dignity was something you dressed for every day. Ruby was not extraordinary in the way newspapers liked she was. Extraordinary in the way neighborhoods remember forever. She worked when she could, laughed easily, and walked with a posture that suggested she'd been taught early that how you carried yourself mattered, because the world was always looking for an excuse not to respect you. On the night she died, she wore a coat that had been mended twice and shoes that pinched, because she believed appearances still counted. No one would ever fully agree on where she was headed or why. What everyone agreed on was that by morning, she would not be coming home, and that whatever happened between those hours would be filed away under words that felt smaller than the truth. By the time dawn settled over Harlem like a weary sigh, Ruby Williams was already being described in the past tense by people who did not know her. The city was efficient that way. A body discovered, a report drafted, a cause suggested before questions had time to form. The official language arrived. First neutral, distant, precise, stripping the story of its human weight before it could bruise anyone with authority. Neighbors learned quickly what kind of case it would be. One of those that moved fast through paperwork and slow through conscience. When Ruby's mother, Eleanor Williams, arrived at the station, she was not met with urgency or compassion, but with a kind of polite impatience, the sort reserved for people whose grief was inconvenient. Eleanor had been strong all her life in a quiet way, the kind of woman who endured rather than confronted, because confrontation often came with consequences she could not afford. She carried herself with careful dignity, even as her hands trembled, even as she repeated her daughter's name to men who did not write it down correctly. She was asked questions that did not sound like questions at all, but judgments disguised as procedure. Where had Ruby been? Who was she with? Why was she out so late? Each word landed like an accusation, and Eleanor felt dimly that the room was not trying to understand what had happened, but to explain why it did not matter. Outside those walls, Harlem was beginning to understand something else entirely. The street had a way of knowing when a line had been crossed, even if the law pretended otherwise. Men who had survived worse than indifference felt a familiar tightening in their chests. Women lowered their voices when Ruby's name came up, as if speaking too loudly might invite the same fate. This was not just about a girl who had died. It was about the pattern everyone recognized, but no one was supposed to name. A young black woman, a convenient narrative, a system eager to move on. By midday, the story reached a man who rarely hurried but never ignored the sound of injustice when it reached his ears. He was seated in a back room that smelled of old wood and stronger ambitions, listening more than speaking, his posture composed as if disorder had no claim on him. Bumpy Johnson had learned long ago that authority did not come from volume, but from certainty, from the ability to remain still while others fidgeted. When Ruby Williams' name was spoken in that room, the air shifted. Bumpy did not react immediately. He asked who she was, where she lived, and how the news had traveled. The questions were not casual. They were deliberate, like a man mapping terrain before stepping onto it. What set Bumpy apart was not brutality or bravado, despite what outsiders believed. It was his understanding of time and consequence. He knew that some injustices demanded patience before action, that rushing toward. Anger often served the very systems that caused the harm. He listened as the story unfolded, as details contradicted each other in the way they always did when truth was being smothered by haste. He said nothing about vengeance, nothing about retaliation. Instead, he asked a single question that stilled the room. Has her mother been treated with respect? The answer was silence, and in that silence, Bumpy found clarity. Respect to him was not a courtesy. It was a measurement of a society's health. When a grieving mother was denied it, something had already gone wrong at a level deeper than crime. He rose then, not abruptly, but with intention, and said he would visit Eleanor Williams that evening. No one offered to accompany him. They understood without being told that this was not a meeting for spectacle or intimidation. It was an act of recognition. Eleanor was surprised when he arrived. She knew his name the way everyone in Harlem did. As something spoken carefully, weighted with rumor and exaggeration. She expected menace and found instead a man who removed his hat indoors, who asked permission before sitting, who listened without interrupting as she described a day that had unmoored her from everything familiar. She spoke of the station, of the way the officers avoided her eyes, of the implication that Ruby's life choices had somehow invited her death. She did not ask Bumpy for help. She did not know how. She simply told the truth as she had lived it, hoping that saying it aloud might make it less heavy. Bumpy did not offer comfort in the way people expected. He did not promise justice as if it were guaranteed. He acknowledged her pain without embellishment and asked her to repeat certain moments, not to interrogate, but to preserve them. He knew that memory, when respected, could become a form of evidence. Before leaving, he said something that Eleanor would remember long after the noise returned to Harlem. They don't get to decide who your daughter was. It was not reassurance. It was a declaration, and it settled into her chest like something solid she could lean against. That night, Harlem did not sleep easily. Rumors spread that the case would be closed quickly, that Ruby would be reduced to a cautionary headline, that the city would protect itself by sacrificing her reputation. Men gathered in places where anger usually fermented, and for once, Bumpy's absence from those rooms was as instructive as his presence often was. He was elsewhere, making calls that were not threats, speaking in tones that did not invite defiance. He reminded people, some reluctantly, some gratefully, that this was not a moment for chaos, but for precision. Rage could be dismissed. Documentation could not. By the third day, the injustice had taken a clearer shape. The official story was forming without input from the people who knew Ruby best. Language was being chosen carefully to imply fault without stating it outright. Eleanor received notice that no further action was planned, that the matter was considered resolved. It was the kind of resolution that closed files but opened wounds. When Bumpy heard this, he did not raise his voice or summon an army. He adjusted his tie, straightened his coat, and prepared to step into a world that preferred he remain a rumor rather than a presence, what no one outside Harlem understood was that Bumpy Johnson's power did not lie in fear but in his refusal to be hurried into illegitimacy. He believed that dignity, once demonstrated consistently, forced even hostile institutions to reckon with it. As he walked through downtown streets that pretended not to see him, he carried Ruby Williams' name. Not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. He did not yet know how the story would end, only that it could not be allowed to end the way the city intended. Harlem learned something unsettling in the days after Ruby Williams was laid to rest. Silence could be manufactured. It had a texture to it, a way of settling over streets like a second skin, smooth and convincing to anyone who did not live beneath it. The city's official machinery moved with a rehearsed calm, issuing statements that sounded compassionate while saying nothing at all. And the papers followed suit, printing phrases so carefully balanced they could not fall toward truth even by accident. To the outside world, the story appeared to be fading, dissolving into the daily churn of misfortune that New York had always produced in abundance. Inside Harlem, however, the quiet felt wrong, as if the air itself were holding something back. Shopkeepers spoke in half-sentences. Mothers lingered longer at windows. Men who had survived wars, prisons, and betrayals found themselves unsettled by the absence of noise, because they understood that this was not peace, it was erasure. Eleanor Williams felt that erasure most acutely in the small hours of the morning, when grief grew louder than the city and memory became relentless. She replayed her last conversation with Ruby again and again, the ordinary words suddenly freighted with unbearable importance. Each time the sun rose, she wondered whether the world would remember her daughter at all, or whether Ruby would become another name folded into a drawer, never to be spoken by anyone who mattered. She had stopped going to the station. The answers there were finished with her. What she had not stopped doing was waiting, though. She did not know for what. Waiting had become a habit, almost a discipline, a way of telling herself that something was still possible. Bumpy Johnson understood that kind of waiting. He had lived long enough to recognize when a city believed it, had won by outlasting outrage. He saw the signs everywhere, the relaxed shoulders of officials, the way certain men began to joke again, the subtle assumption that Harlem would accept what it had been given, because it always had. That assumption offended him more than the original injustice. It was one thing to harm a girl, and quite another to believe her people would forget her. Bumpy did not mistake patience for passivity. His stillness concealed a mind moving deliberately through layers of consequence. He spent his days listening, not just to allies but to the kinds of men who spoke carelessly when they thought no one of consequence was present. He learned who had been instructed to stop asking questions, who had been warned off the case, and who had begun repeating a version of Ruby's story that sounded suspiciously rehearsed. What made this moment dangerous was not overt hostility, but polite dismissal. Doors were not slammed in Bumpy's face. They were held open just long enough for him to realize that nothing lay beyond them. Meetings were granted and yielded nothing. Promises were made and dissolved into procedure. This was how institutions defended themselves, not with fists, but with paperwork and patience, daring grief to exhaust itself. Even men who respected Bumpy began to grow uneasy, sensing that restraint might be mistaken for weakness by those accustomed to bullying. The pressure to act, to do something visible, irreversible, hung heavy in the rooms where Harlem's anger usually gathered. It was in one such room, dimly lit and crowded with expectation, that Bumpy finally spoke in a way that unsettled even his closest confidants. He reminded them that history rarely remembered who shouted first, but it always remembered who spoke last with authority. He said that violence would not resurrect Ruby, nor would it cleanse her name. What it would do, he warned, was give the city permission to dismiss her life as collateral damage in a war it had already decided Harlem was fighting. The room grew quiet, not because everyone agreed, but because everyone understood the cost of ignoring him. Bumpy was not asking for obedience. He was demanding discipline, and discipline required faith that he was building toward something larger than retribution. The turning point began to take shape in a place no one expected. A downtown charity luncheon where influence disguised itself as benevolence. Bumpy attended not as a spectacle, but as a curiosity. Impeccably dressed, his presence a subtle challenge to the unspoken rules of the room. He did not dominate conversations. He allowed others to reveal themselves. He listened as men congratulated one another on progress and civility, on how far the city had come, all while congratulating themselves for having survived yet another scandal without consequence. When Ruby's case was mentioned briefly, awkwardly, it was spoken of as a tragedy without context, a misfortune without authors. Bumpy let the words pass, then asked, calmly, whether tragedy became less tragic when its victim was unnamed. The question landed softly, but it did not disappear. It lingered, forcing those within earshot to confront the emptiness of their language. What followed was not confrontation, but exposure. Bumpy had spent weeks gathering not secrets, but truths that had been scattered and ignored. He did not brandish them publicly. He placed them gently into the hands of people who prided themselves on decency. He spoke to a church leader whose sermons reached far beyond Harlem, to a business owner whose donations shaped policy quietly, to a journalist whose reputation depended on being seen as fair. To each, he offered the same thing: clarity without embellishment. He described how Eleanor Williams had been treated, how Ruby's character was being subtly rewritten to excuse institutional neglect, how silence was being mistaken for resolution. He did not ask for favors. He asked whether this was the city they believed in. The response was not immediate, and that delay tested everyone's resolve. Rumors spread that Bumpy was losing control, that his refusal to escalate would cost him credibility. There were whispers of men willing to act without his consent, convinced that restraint had reached its limit. Bumpy heard these whispers and addressed them not with threats, but with honesty. He admitted that he did not know whether the city would change course. He admitted that justice was not guaranteed. What he refused to admit was that Ruby's dignity was negotiable. That distinction mattered, and slowly, grudgingly, it held. When the shift finally came, it did not announce itself with headlines. It arrived as a recalibration, subtle but unmistakable. A reporter began asking different questions. A community leader requested a meeting that had been denied before. A councilman, previously silent, expressed concern about procedural irregularities. These were small movements, but Bumpy recognized them as the early signs of something loosening its grip. The city was not yet ready to confess wrongdoing, but it was beginning to feel watched by a conscience it had underestimated. Eleanor Williams sensed the change before she understood it. People who had avoided her eyes now stopped to speak to apologize for their silence, to tell her they remembered Ruby. She was invited to share her story in spaces that had once dismissed her as inconvenient. Each time she felt fear tighten her throat, but she spoke anyway, guided by a conviction she had not known she possessed. She did not accuse, she described. She did not beg. She bore witness. And in doing so, she reclaimed something the city had tried to take from her: authority over her own grief. The tension in Harlem did not dissipate, it sharpened. Everyone understood that this was the most dangerous phase, the moment when change seemed possible but far from assured. Institutions often struck hardest when they sensed their narrative slipping. Bumpy prepared for that inevitability not by fortifying defenses, but by reinforcing restraint. He instructed his people to remain visible but composed, present but unimpeachable. He wanted the city to see Harlem not as a threat, but as a mirror, reflecting back the consequences of indifference that by the time the city realized Ruby Williams' name had stopped fading, it was already too late to pretend nothing was happening. What unsettled New York was not the noise, there was very little of that, but the way the story had begun to resist disappearance. It surfaced in church basements and barber shops, in classrooms where teachers hesitated before turning the page, in the careful pauses of men who measured their words now because they sensed the room listening back. The city had survived scandals before by letting time sand down the edges of outrage, but this one did not erode the way it was supposed to. It sharpened. It grew quieter and therefore more dangerous, because quiet does not beg for attention. It demands accountability. Bumpy Johnson felt the shift in the rhythm of his days. Calls came later at night and ended sooner, voices clipped, sentences incomplete. Doors that had opened politely now opened cautiously, as if the people behind them were reconsidering what politeness might cost. He did not mistake this for victory. He understood power too well to confuse movement with momentum. When institutions feel threatened, they do not always strike outward. Sometimes they retreat inward, hardening themselves behind process and precedent until truth exhausts itself trying to get through. Bumpy prepared for that possibility with the same calm precision he brought to everything else. He stopped pushing where resistance grew strongest and began pulling threads that had been overlooked, trusting that a tapestry unraveled more easily. When handled gently, the new danger emerged not from the police or the papers, but from a quiet administrative maneuver that most people would never notice. A sealed review, conducted behind closed doors, was scheduled to finalize Ruby Williams' case once and for all. It was presented as routine, procedural, necessary to bring closure. Closure, Bumpy knew, was often the word used when the truth was about to be buried with formal language and an official stamp. Once the review concluded, any further questions could be dismissed as disruptive, even disrespectful. The city would declare itself finished with Ruby, whether Harlem agreed or not. Eleanor Williams received notice of the review in the mail, written in language so careful it felt almost tender. It thanked her for her cooperation, expressed regret for her loss, and informed her that no further testimony would be required. The letter shook in her hands as she read it. It sounded like kindness, but it carried the unmistakable weight of finality. She understood instinctively what it meant. The story would be decided without her voice. For the first time since Ruby's death, Eleanor felt anger break through her grief, sharp and clarifying. She did not cry. She folded the letter neatly and went to see Bumpy Johnson. When she arrived, she expected him to already know. She was right. He read the letter slowly, his expression unchanged, and then placed it carefully on the table, as if it deserved respect even though it offered none. He did not speak immediately. Silence stretched between them, not awkward but deliberate. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady. He told Eleanor that this was the moment the city believed it could end the conversation on its own terms. He also told her that conversations did not belong to institutions alone. They belonged to the people who had lived them. What made this moment perilous was not the review itself, but the temptation it created. Many in Harlem urged Bumpy to disrupt it openly, to stage protests, to force the city's hand through spectacle. Others, more cynical, argued that the process was fixed and resistance would only invite retaliation. Bumpy listened to both sides and rejected the false choice they offered. He did not believe in shouting at walls or surrendering to them. He believed in positioning truth where it could not be ignored, even by those determined not to see it. His strategy unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. He asked Eleanor whether she was willing to speak, not in the review, but before it, not in anger, but with clarity. He reached out to the people who had begun to circle Ruby's story with cautious interest, and asked them a different question. If the city closed this case without hearing the mother, what would that say about every other promise it made? He did not frame it as scandal. He framed it as a test of credibility. And credibility, he knew, was something institutions valued deeply, even when they pretended otherwise. As the date of the review approached, tension thickened. The city's tone shifted from polite dismissal to restrained irritation. Officials warned against unnecessary agitation. Advisors urged Eleanor to accept the process and move on for her own well-being. The language of concern was deployed, like a shield, protecting authority while isolating dissent. Eleanor felt the pressure keenly, but she did not retreat. Something in her had changed. Grief had stripped away her fear of appearing difficult. She understood now that silence would not protect her. It would only confirm the city's assumptions. On the morning before the review, a gathering took place that was never officially announced, and therefore impossible to prevent. It was not a protest. There were no signs, no chants, no raised fists. It was a public conversation, convened in a hall that had hosted weddings and funerals, where respect was expected as a matter of course. The audience was mixed: Harlem residents, clergy, business leaders, journalists, and a few officials who attended out of curiosity or caution. Bumpy arrived early, took a seat near the back, and said nothing. He was not the focus, and he did not intend to be. Eleanor Williams stood at the front with a composure that surprised even her. She did not accuse the city of murder. She did not demand punishment. She spoke of Ruby as a daughter, as a young woman who believed that behaving properly would keep her safe. She described the night Ruby did not come home and the days that followed, the questions that implied blame, the procedures that replaced compassion. She spoke of being thanked for her cooperation while being denied participation. Her voice did not waver, and that steadiness unsettled the room more than anger ever could. People leaned forward, not because they were being commanded to listen, but because listening felt unavoidable. The power of that moment lay in its simplicity. There were no secrets revealed, no dramatic revelations, just a clear articulation of injustice that could not be dismissed as rumor or hysteria. When Eleanor finished, the room remained silent, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The silence carried weight, the kind that presses on the chest and demands a response. Journalists glanced at one another, sensing a story that could not be reduced to sound bites. Officials shifted in their seats, aware that the review scheduled for the next day would now unfold under a gaze it had not anticipated. Bumpy did not speak then. He waited until the gathering began to disperse, until the conversations grew quieter and more thoughtful. He approached one of the officials present, a man known for his careful adherence to process, and said only a few words, spoken without challenge or threat. If tomorrow closes this case without her voice, today becomes the record. The sentence was not a warning, it was a fact. The official nodded slowly, understanding exactly what had been said. The city could proceed as planned, but it would do so knowing that its actions would be measured against a standard it had failed to meet publicly. That night, Harlem held its breath again, but the feeling was different now. It was not fear or helplessness. It was anticipation sharpened by resolve. The review would go forward, but it would not be invisible. Ruby Williams' name would be present in every room, in every decision, carried not by outrage, but by dignity. Bumpy Johnson returned home late, his movements unhurried, his mind alert. He knew the city might still choose expedience over justice. He also knew that something irreversible had already happened. The silence that once protected power had been replaced by a silence that watched it closely. The morning the city intended to finish with Ruby Williams arrived without drama, which was exactly how power preferred it. There were no crowds outside the building where the review was scheduled, no chanting to justify calling the day unruly. The sky hung low and gray, cooperative, as if even the weather had been briefed to keep its voice down. Inside, polished floors reflected shoes that moved with professional confidence. Men and women who believed they understood how history worked, how it could be managed, contained, concluded. To them, this was an administrative exercise, the final tightening of language that would allow everyone to return to their routines with a clean conscience. They did not expect interruption, and they did not expect resistance that refused to look like resistance. Eleanor Williams arrived early, dressed as she always did for church, not because she was trying to make a statement, but because this was how she honored things that mattered. She had not been invited to speak. She had been advised, gently and repeatedly, that the process was not designed for public testimony, that it was best handled by professionals. She took her seat anyway. Hands folded, posture composed, her presence a quiet contradiction to every assumption the city had made about who belonged in that room. She did not look afraid. She looked resolved, and that unsettled a few people who noticed her before they realized who she was. Bumpy Johnson did not enter with her. He understood the choreography of authority too well to disrupt it with theatrics. He arrived later, took a seat along the wall, and waited. There was nothing deferential about his stillness. It was the stillness of a man who had already done the work and now intended to let others reveal themselves. He had spent weeks arranging the conditions for this moment, not by force, but by alignment, placing truth where it could be seen, positioning witnesses where they could listen, ensuring that whatever decision emerged would do so under a weight that could not be shrugged off later. If the city wanted to close the case, it would have to do so knowing exactly what it was closing its eyes to. The review began the way such proceedings always did, with language designed to drain emotion from memory. Facts were summarized, timelines recited, conclusions suggested with careful neutrality. Ruby Williams was referred to by her last name more often than her first, as if distance could be maintained through formality. Eleanor listened without flinching, though each sentence felt like a test of endurance. She waited for the moment she had rehearsed in her mind and then let go of, understanding that rehearsals often dissolved under pressure. When the chair announced that the findings would be finalized without further comment, something in the room shifted, not loudly, but decisively. Eleanor stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt. She waited until she was acknowledged, and when the chair hesitated, she spoke anyway, with a courtesy that left no room for dismissal. She said she understood the rules of the room, that she had been told she was not required to speak. She said she also understood something else now, that silence, when enforced, became a kind of verdict. She asked calmly whether a process that concluded without hearing from the person most affected could reasonably claim legitimacy. The question was not accusatory, it was surgical. It exposed the contradiction at the heart of the proceedings. Without challenging anyone's authority directly, the room reacted the way institutions often do when confronted with moral clarity, with discomfort disguised as procedure. There were murmurs about protocol, reminders about time constraints. Eleanor listened, nodded, and then said something that reframed everything, that she was not there to argue outcomes, only to ensure the record reflected reality. She spoke briefly, deliberately, recounting not the night Ruby died, but the days that followed, the waiting, the insinuations, the polite dismissal that communicated worthlessness more effectively than open hostility ever could. She spoke of her daughter's life with specificity, as if detail itself were an act of resistance against erasure. When she finished, she thanked the room for listening. Even those who had not intended to. No one clapped. Applause would have trivialized the moment. The silence that followed was heavy, and it belonged to Eleanor. In that silence, the review's language felt suddenly insufficient, its neutrality exposed as a posture rather than a principle. The chair cleared his throat, glanced at his notes, and then, after a pause that would later be remembered, acknowledged that the testimony would be entered into the record. It was a small concession, procedural, almost invisible to anyone not trained to recognize its significance. But Bumpy Johnson noticed. He understood that power rarely reversed itself in grand gestures. It retreated inch by inch when forced to confront its reflection. What happened next was not a confession or an apology. It was something subtler and, in some ways, more consequential. The final language of the review changed. Words that had implied closure without accountability were softened, then revised. References to unavoidable circumstances were replaced with acknowledgments of procedural failures. The case was not reopened in the dramatic sense people hoped for, but it was not buried either. It was marked, flagged for further examination, stripped of the narrative that would have blamed Ruby for her own disappearance. In the currency of institutions, this was a loss of face, and everyone in the room understood it. Outside, the city absorbed the news the way it always did, unevenly, imperfectly. Headlines did not scream victory, but they did not dismiss the story anymore. Ruby Williams' name appeared without insinuation, without quotation marks that suggested doubt. Commentators spoke cautiously about the need for reform, about the importance of listening. It was not justice in its fullest form, but it was recognition. And recognition altered the landscape in ways anger never could. For Eleanor, the change was immediate and deeply personal. People began to greet her differently, not with pity but with respect. She was asked to speak in spaces that had once closed their doors. She chose her words carefully, understanding the responsibility that came with being heard. She did not become an activist in the theatrical sense. She became a witness, steady and precise, reminding people that systems were made of choices and that choices could be examined. Bumpy Johnson receded from view, as he always did when his presence threatened to overshadow the point. He did not claim credit, did not allow his name to be attached to the outcome publicly. Those who knew understood his role, and those who did not need to. His satisfaction, if it could be called that, lay in the restored balance of the room, in the knowledge that restraint had forced a reckoning without spilling into chaos. He had not defeated the city. He had compelled it to pause, to listen, to acknowledge a truth it had intended to ignore. In Harlem, the change was felt not as triumph but as relief. The neighborhood did not celebrate, it exhaled. Mothers walked with their heads a little higher, not because the world had become safe, but because it had been reminded that they were watching. Men spoke of Ruby not as a warning but as a reminder of what was lost and of what had been reclaimed in the process of remembering her properly. Her name became part of the neighborhood's moral vocabulary, a shorthand for dignity defended without spectacle. The final image is not of a courtroom or a headline, but of a quiet evening on a Harlem street. Eleanor Williams stands at her window as the sun sets, the city humming below. She holds a photograph of Ruby, not as evidence, but as memory, and for the first time since her daughter's death, the weight in her chest eases slightly. Somewhere else, Bumpy Johnson walks unhurried through the neighborhood, nodding to people who nod back, his authority intact and unspoken. The city continues, imperfect and restless, but altered in a way that cannot be entirely undone. Because what Ruby Williams left behind was not just grief. It was a question the city would now have to answer every time it chose convenience over compassion, silence over truth. And in the spaces where that question lingered, power learned something it rarely admitted aloud, that dignity, once defended with discipline and restraint, had a way of outlasting even the most carefully constructed lies.